As you're seated, I love that song sort of is this reaffirmation that the good news of last week, the good news of Easter, isn't just good news for Jesus. It's really good news for us. That promise of life that follows life, and so I hope you hear and are reassured of life that is what God promises us. You know, I was thinking this past week about something. You know, many of us had to make some choices and change some things during the last couple of years with COVID. My wife and I, at one point, decided to cancel our membership to a gym, and recently sort of realized it's time to kind of get back into exercise, and not just the sort of walking, golfing kind of exercise, but sort of real exercise. And so we went back to the gym, and when I went back, I was just amazed at how many people didn't give up exercise during COVID. There were so many people that were so strong and so fit, and I found myself the first week or so just sort of overwhelmed by being back. It was every time I tried to do something, I started to feel like I was going to get really sore. So I just really walked around, and I just loved watching people exercise. It was really amazing. There were so many people that were so strong, and they were doing incredibly difficult workouts, and I would just sort of stand there and wow, it was awesome. It was awesome. It was really good. And then at the end of it, I would tell people that I had just gone to the gym. I had just gone to the gym. It was really good. And then it occurred to me kind of why we're giggling is that ultimately, you don't go to a gym to watch people exercise. You go to the gym to do the exercises that make you healthy and strong. I say that because I think in many respects, the church too often times has almost gone to the gym to watch people exercise. And what I mean by that is that the church so oftentimes can admire Jesus, but look nothing like, behave nothing like Jesus did. And so this morning, we're starting this sermon series that is the sort of what's the continuation of Easter? And the sermon series that we're starting is called Copy and Paste. Right? We're trying to explore what it looks like to copy what Jesus did, who he was, how he lived, and paste that into our lives with respect to how we live and what we do. Right? It's sort of based on this idea that I have, and perhaps many have had before, and that is that it is a lot easier to worship someone than it is to imitate them. Right? It's much easier, it's much more convenient to sort of admire someone or worship someone than it is to imitate them and to do the things that they did. It's actually, I think, one of the great critiques of the church is that we oftentimes admire Jesus, but we don't imitate him at all. And so beginning today, we're going to be over these next several weeks trying to get a sense of who Jesus really is, how he lived, what he did, and how we want to copy those things and paste them into our lives, into our ministry as we move forward. And in order to do that, we sort of recognize that it's not always clear. We've sort of domesticated Jesus in some ways that can confuse us when we even gather for worship, because it's wonderful to sing praises, but if this is all there is, then one would wonder if Jesus has really provided an example that we want to follow. And so we're going to look at some passages over these next several weeks that really get a sense of who he was and how he lived. And this morning we look at one from the Gospel of John. And I always am reminded of the fact that preachers tend to have their go-to passages, right? Those passages that we kind of lean on, we look to quite often. We might even preach more than other passages. And I wonder what your go-to passages are. Like if you had to preach next Sunday, wouldn't that be awesome if you had to preach next Sunday? But if you had to preach next Sunday, what's the passage that comes to mind that you would preach on? In the chat room, maybe online, what's that passage that you would preach on if you had to preach next Sunday? Here, anyone, just what's the story? What's the passage you would preach on? The Good Samaritan.
Joyful noise.
Make a joyful noise, Psalm 150. Book of Ruth. Amen. We got like a biblical scholar in the house. Book of Ruth. I love it. What else? Revelation. Was that? love your neighbor as yourself. Like we've got these passages, these stories that's our sermon, right? And those are lovely. I'd encourage you to think about what are those passages. If you had to preach next Sunday and you got to pick the passage, what would it be? One of my go-to passages is the one that we're going to read this morning. It's from John's Gospel, chapter 13. Right? It's where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. And so I'm going to invite you to listen as I read John 13. And many of us just heard this, and it might be quite familiar, but I'd encourage you to open your heart to hear it in a new way as we gather this morning. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and to go be with God. Having loved his own who were in the world, Jesus loved them to the end. The devil had already put into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. And during the supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. And then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." And Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." And so Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, then not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." And Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For Jesus knew who was to betray him. And for that reason, he said, "Not all of you are clean." And so there's this moment here where Jesus is taking on. And we know that in John's gospel, this is that sacramental meal, right? There's no bread, there's no wine. There's this servant sacrificial washing of feet, the way in which Jesus does something that was sort of beneath what someone would have done who was the teacher and the leader of this group. And it's not clear to them, it's certainly not clear to Peter what he's doing, and that's what unfolds there. But then we pick it up in verse 12, and we read that after Jesus had washed their feet, he put on his robe and had returned to the table, and he said to them. I just want to pause here and say this is where we know that in the Gospel of John, things have changed. Jesus' time is running out, and so what he's saying has real weight and importance. I was sharing this morning that my oldest son graduates from college in 2 weeks. And as we're getting ready to go out there, I just found on my phone the bullet points of what I said to him when I dropped him off at college. Right? When you have that last conversation before you drop him off. I found those bullet points. And it's all the things that you just want to make sure he understood. We're kind of in that place in the life of Jesus here where he knows he's not going to be with them much longer. And so he's saying, hey, pay attention to this. Do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example that you should also do. Do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. Right? It's this reminder that Jesus is saying to them, if you think the point is to admire me, you've missed the point. He sets them an example of what they are to do. Not what they're to think, not what they're to believe, not what they're to say, but what they are to do. And what they are to do is very specific. And it's very clear with respect to how Jesus performs this act of selfless servanthood and washes their feet. And as we think about what Jesus is doing here, it's an act that really surprises them and doesn't make sense. And I think so oftentimes we can read this and it both makes sense and doesn't make sense to us. Right? Because we can feel like Peter and think that there's no way I would want Jesus to wash my feet, and be grateful that if that's what it means to be a follower of Jesus, then wash all of me. I want all of me to be with you. But as we gather and as we start these weeks that sort of try to unpack what it means to focus our lives on Jesus, I want to suggest that we at times can struggle because we intentionally or unintentionally, have mistaken going to church with being the church, with being a part and belonging to a community of faith, and one that looks like this. One that's filled with people who don't see things the same way, who don't come from the same professional backgrounds, who don't come from the same religious backgrounds, who don't have the same experience. We know that Peter will go on to be a leader in the church, and Judas, whose feet are washed by Jesus, will be the one who turns him in. Oh, by the way, before we're too hard on Judas, Peter's the one that betrays him. We know all of these things. This group is profoundly diverse. And we sometimes think that the point is to go to church to be with people that are like us, when in fact we're supposed to be the church with and for one another. And it sounds so good, but it can sometimes be superficial if it's not what we do. Because Jesus says this is what we are to do. And we all know this, right? But what you do is what you become. Right? The habits of our lives become who we are, really. Right? We can say, well, we all know when people have told us things, they keep saying things, but when we see how they live, what they say and how they live, if they're not congruent, who they are is what we see. Right? It's what they've done, what they do, how they treat people. God's love is unconditional, and then they put conditions on it. It doesn't really matter what you say. What do you do? And so when we look at Jesus, we really have to remind ourselves that he doesn't call us to admire him. He sets an example that we would imitate him, that we would copy him and paste how he lived into how we live. And so we start by reminding ourselves that the characteristics of Jesus that we are to do and to copy are characteristics of humility and servanthood. And I know that the next several weeks we're going to be talking about how we live out in the world with these things, but for today, I want us to think about what it means to take on a posture of humility and servanthood with one another, with each other here. As we talk about what it means to discover and to develop this post-pandemic church, what will it mean to in humility serve one another, to love one another? Because that's what we're called to do with one another. We could quickly go around and find things that we disagreed on. We're in different stages of life. We're in different circumstances of life. Some of us are here feeling profoundly joyful. Some of us are here feeling heavy-hearted and burdened. Some of us are here with great conviction, and some of us are here with just spirit-wrenching questions. And if we think that it's about trying to figure out who's got it right and who's got it wrong, we've missed the point. And if we think that today is just about admiring Jesus and then walking out, it's not the point if we don't do life with and for one another. To actually accept, to listen, to open ourselves to, as much as I know, I'm confident you can teach me something. As much as you know, I'm confident I can teach you something. As good as you are, I'm confident you've made mistakes. As awesome as I am, you all just saw me make a mistake. Right? And then when we can in humility acknowledge that, we open ourselves to one another differently. We don't reflect the judgmentalism of our world or the judgmentalism of religion. If our goal is to be religious, we got to set a new goal. Because Jesus invites us to be faithful, and it's a faithfulness that does what he does. And the passage ends in this way that I think is important, and I think it's profound. Because Jesus says, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. I love that he gives a commandment. He doesn't give a suggestion. He doesn't give them a new suggestion. He gives them a new commandment. John's gospel begins with an invitation to follow Jesus. Jesus doesn't say sit down and take notes. He doesn't say sit down and make sure you write the answers correctly. Here are the answers to the test. He says, follow me, share life with me. And as he's leaving, he gives a new commandment, and the commandment is not make sure you get your theological ducks in a row. It's not make sure you believe the same thing, make sure you articulate your beliefs in the same way. What he says is, do what I have done. Humble yourselves and serve one another. That's the commandment. And that's how people will know and experience the love that God has for us, the love that God has for one another, that becomes a transformative love that really can shape and change a world that right now lacks humility and lacks a servant's heart. Folks, as we try to copy Jesus and paste who he was into our lives, may we take on the humility and the servanthood that he tells us to do and to live out with and for one another. Amen.